Hey guys, it's Mountain Walk, and today we got a new video, new decks, new tournaments. This time we got one in Russia, or at least ostensibly it's in Russia. It looks like in Russia, so that's pretty cool. Thought this was interesting because we've got, stuff all over the place for pre-modern. You got stuff in Europe and Central and South America, the United States, Canada, all over the place. So I thought it would be cool to highlight another area, and it's a fairly largish tournament, I think almost 40 people, so that's pretty cool. So I think it'd be really neat to just, see these different decks, because oftentimes, especially back in the day, this was a lot more common, maybe a little bit less so now, but there's a big disparity, between deck building, between like, say, Europe and then like America and stuff. So that was always kind of interesting. Of course, in Japan too, again, they always have very crazy different decks. I always thought that was interesting. But yeah, so in that vein, let's see what our good Russian friends are making over here. All right, so the first up we have our good friend Madness. That's right, all the good classic regular Madness cards with only a little bit of spice. So this is a fairly typical sort of Madness list. You got all your discard outlets, and then your Madness cards, and your Days and Circular Logics, all your counter magic, all this good stuff. And of course, Quiet Speculation. This card is, again, it's not as good as, say, something like Intuition, because obviously Intuition can get you Wonder, of course. But Quiet Speculation is perfectly fine replacement for that, because really a lot of times you just want to get your Deep Analysis and or Roar the Worm for grinding and things like that. So that's really sweet. And then of course, nice mana base. Again, that's really solid. The only spicy thing, of course, would be the counterspell main deck. Sometimes you'll see like mana leaks and things like that in the Madness deck, but they're playing a 1-up counterspell, which I think is fine, because you don't really want to have it early because you want to be dropping guys and things like that, and you don't have a ton of blue sources regardless. So I think the 1-up counterspell is nice. I kind of like 9 counterspells, 8 to 9 to 10 maybe. I think that's pretty great. Again, a lot of really just standard Madness stuff. Sideboard itself, pretty good too. Pretty stock, pretty standard, of course. I love Waterfront Bouncer. This card is so sweet. I love the everything about Mercadia being totally upside down and wonky. You got your buff Merfolk and your smart goblins and your upside down mountain city and the whole 9 yards, the whole thing. So that's pretty interesting. I think it's maybe a little much for 3 and 3 naturalized. That might be a bit excessive, but I think six of those sort of artifact and enchantment hate cards, I think that's mostly fine. I feel like I'd almost rather just play like another cut like a naturalize and or annul for like another hydroblast or chill or something like that, just for more red hate, which can be a difficult matchup. So, but yeah, the rest is pretty sweet, pretty good. Definitely like this very nice, clean stock list. Looks great. So there you go. Okay, so now we have Goblins. Again, most of these decks, of course, are going to be like 80% the same, at least the Goblins decks, because so many of the slots are sort of set in stone. But this one, we have a green splash, and we're playing Naturalized main deck. So we have the main deck Forest. Again, I think with the main deck Forest and only the 2 Naturalized main deck, it feels like the Forest is too much of a colorless source, and especially if like you're playing 24 lands, 9 colorless sources, that's a little bit greedy. Again, 16 colored sources, red mana sources, and 8 colorless sources, so being like the waste ports, or again, splash colors like the Forest. I think that's a little much, so I'd probably cut a waste report or something like that. Which one you'd want to cut is, again, it's an interesting conversation, but I don't think it's particularly clear cut at this point. But anyways, the rest, all the goblins and stuff look fine. The 2 main deck naturalize, yep, I think that's great. You know, I think there's a lot of value in main decking naturalize in Premodern. There's just a lot of stuff, really powerful artifact and enchantments. And of course in the sideboard we got kind of some wonky stuff like the Goblin Pyromancer, not that weird, can be kind of good in the mirror, kind of. But Goblin Pyromancer is a pretty interesting card. It's good with Prospector because you can play it, swing, and then sack it and whatever. So that's interesting. Again, Color of the Claw, it's, you know, same thing I say every time. It's just a solution looking for a problem. Not a big fan of it. Again, all of my previous critiques, like it's just you need splash colors, it's telegraphed, and so on and so on. Not really needed. I do like the extra sharpshooter in the sideboard just because like there's just a lot of decks, especially like the aggressive, like super aggressive decks, where sharpshooter is very good. They oftentimes don't play a ton of removal, and double sharpshooter is often GG. And those matchups can be a little difficult, a little wonky. So having like your pyrokinesis and then your sharpshooters and stuff can really shore those matchups up. So yeah, there you go. All right, so this time we have the Pyromancer main deck, but no Prospectors, which I think is a mistake, but a lot of the Goblin slots are actually eaten up by the Living Death and Cabal Therapy, which I think are pretty interesting cards. But yeah, not a big fan of. I think I would actually cut like 1 or 2 Incinerators at least for like another Fanatic and another Prospector, at least another Prospector. Like 3 Fanatic just feels crazy to me, but again, the cuts have to come somewhere. So yeah, it's a little, definitely a balancing match. But because this deck is so heavy on black cards, especially double black cards, and the sideboard has got a bunch of black cards, I really think that, yeah, the 2 swamps is kind of okay. If you had 24 lands, I'd be a lot happier with it, but you need at least 1 swamp, obviously, to fetch. But I think you really, especially with like all of these black cards, I think you just got to take the hit to some of the aggressive matchups and play, you know, 1 or 2 City of Brass. There's really not really any getting around it. If you want these other powerful cards in, say, like the grindier matchups, you know, you have to make concessions somewhere. So yeah, again, I've always liked 1 or 2 City of Brass in these decks, and of course, 24 lands. But yeah, this one's even a little bit even greedier with like all these colorless sources, although again, the swamps actually do cast more spells, so they're a little bit less like colorless sources. Yeah, so there's a lot of wonky stuff sort of going on there. And then in the sideboard, I think the Duress and Pyroblast, there's no way, because the cards have so much overlap, there's no way you're really going to be able to board these in. I mean, you already only have 31 Goblins, so like you can board out the Living Death, but then it's like after that you're really starting to cut into your ringleaders, and I think that's you know, a little it's just not a good idea. Obviously, if you're trying to like beat up on control decks by playing like Revs and Therapies or something, but like making your ringleaders worse, I mean, you're not actually really getting anywhere. So yeah, I mean, there's the issues of overboarding. The cards are so similar that I think you really want to, you know, cut down on those quite a bit. Obviously, Duress is very good with Therapy. Pyroblast is really powerful too. I haven't really cracked the code, so to speak, on how many of those effects that you want. And of course, it's a little bit different if you're playing main deck Cabal Therapy, of course. So, you know, you really got to think of the full 75 too. So that's a little wonky, but the Drownless Crusades and Pyrokinesis and Crypts and stuff like that, that's of course fairly normal. But yeah, I would say 24 lands, of course, probably cut a swamp for 2 City of Brass. You definitely want another Prospector, and I'd like to get another Fanatic in there. I don't think you're really going to need 4 Incinerator. And it's definitely a very slower, dirtier card, and you already have stuff like Living Death to really actually act as removal, and as well as a big sort of combo finish. So yeah, I think Incinerator is a little less needed, so I definitely cut 2 of those probably. So yeah, lot of stuff going on here, pretty interesting stuff. So it's good that we can kind of go over all of that. All right, and now we just have a fairly typical Turboland Oath. So just Oath, and then you have the Hornegreed and Exploration stuff going on, which is always pretty fun. Not a huge fan of this deck, mostly just because it's so dirtily. Oath's value is obviously like if they don't play creatures, you have a bunch of dead cards, and hard casting any of your creatures is just really unexciting. So I've never been a huge fan of this deck. Although I love the way it looks, it's got a lot of numbers, it's got a lot of really powerful cards. Obviously, things just when the rubber meets the road, they just don't come together in the right way. But we do have some interesting tech with Thwart. Thwart's obviously pretty sweet. On late game, it's you can use Thwart to obviously counter stuff, but the alternate cost, returning islands is very good with Horn of Greed and Exploration to draw a bunch of cards. So that's cool. Obviously, this deck is taking their Sly matchup very seriously, or just the red decks in general. 4 Beb, 4 Chill, there you go. I mean, if you just really don't want to lose to red decks, there you go. That's the way to do it. Um, or at least, typically, you do have to draw the cards. But anyways, got the 1 Shard Phoenix, again, great versus Weenie decks. Definitely a very powerful card to oath up. Naturalize, of course, against artifacts and enchantments, and Brain Freeze. I'm guessing this is more of a card against like control decks to mill them out, I'm pretty sure. Brain Freeze is pretty interesting. I'm not exactly sure where those are coming in, because obviously someone needs to just play a bunch of spells or something. Not exactly sure what's going on there with that, but because I don't think you're really wanting to target yourself. Not sure, but the Brain Freeze is interesting. I'll have to think about that one. Maybe you'll figure it out next time. But anyways, yep, that's Oath. All right, and now we just have a fairly standard list for a replenish. Sideboard very clean too. 4 Chill, 4 Defense Grid, 4 Swords, 3 Stifle. Stifle, of course, is good against things like Crypt, all sorts of, or even something like Pernicious Deed, if you have a bunch of enchantments in play, that kind of stuff. So yeah, Stifle, pretty neat. So pretty solid sideboard card there. And yeah, no, not much else going on here. 1 Enlightened Tutor main deck to tutor for, Seal of Removal, Seal of Cleansing, that kind of thing. You can get an attunement to draw more cards. So yeah, definitely a little bit different than some of the lists we've been seeing recently, but again, same basic plan that we've seen for these replenish decks. All right, and now we have, again, red-green goblins. Unfortunately, again, too few lands. 22, can't do it. You gotta play 24. That's just how it is. I don't make the rules. Well, okay, I do make the rules, but so yeah, that means you have to listen to me. So 24 lands is definitely really what you want to be doing. But yeah, obviously, again, Green Splash is fine. We've got Pyrokinesis and Naturalize. Main deck Naturalize, of course, very good. Main deck Color of the Claw, like, again, why? just why? And then, of course, in the sideboard, we see more Color of the Claw. All right. Let's see. Yeah, but the 1-outs and stuff are pretty standard. Prospector, Tinkerer, Sharpshooter, and Goblin King. Main deck Pyrokinesis is pretty sweet. Again, very sweet in the Mirror and other aggressive decks, so nothing weird there. Flaring Pain's a little strange. Stuff like Circle of Protection Red is not like a hard lock versus goblins. Like, it's pretty easy to overload cops just because you have so many permanent sources of damage. So yeah, it's Circle of Protection is not always the end-all be-all versus this deck, or Story Circle for that matter. So Flaring Pain I'm not a huge fan of. Again, I think I'd rather just be playing something like Anarchy. But again, you also have Naturalizes, which work too, which of course we see another Naturalize in the sideboard, and then Tranquil Domain. Again, that's an interesting one. old school back to nature, except this one doesn't kill auras, but hits everything else, so that's pretty sweet. And the Blood Moon's a little atypical, but it's not a bad card because obviously Blood Moon is great against decks with a ton of non-basics. Obviously can be game winning occasionally. So yeah, Blood Moon definitely a pretty sweet card, pretty powerful option. Obviously it can shut off, since you are splashing, it can shut off your green cards if you don't, if you're unable to fetch out a forest in time. But the rest again looks pretty normal. All right, and now we have, well, it's just Sly. This one's a little bit wonky. Obviously, the main deck Goblin Patrol is unusual. It's not a bad card, but it can be pretty awkward and screw with your curve because of the echo. So that's kind of annoying. Like I said, I like Goblin Patrol, but if I was going to play it, it'd be like a 2-of. So like it's a pretty good turn 2 to 3 play, right? As another 1 mana 2/1. Obviously the echo makes that, 2 mana, but being able to split it up is fine. And then of course Blistering Firecat. This card is a little unusual. I mean, you typically, I mean, it's not like Ball Lightning is bad, but these cards are pretty slow, and they are very bad versus like if someone is playing a lot of Hydroblasts or something like that. Obviously, Firecat can get around Color Hosers because you can morph it, which is pretty sweet. But yeah, it's pretty awkward card in the mid to late game versus the blue deck. So not a huge fan of that. But I mean, Blistering Firecat is a huge amount of damage. 4 mana, 7 damage is sweet, or even more consistent damage by just playing as like a Grey Ogre, right? Grey Ogres are 3 mana 2/2s, something like that. So that's not too weird. 2x Flame Rift main deck, I think that's actually okay. Like, I don't know if I would play it. I don't think it's a bad choice. Again, it can be awkward in the mirror versus other aggressive decks. That's weird. But 2 mana 4 damage is obviously a very good rate. Yeah, I mean, obviously it's not great with a bunch of fetch lands, but it's mostly just, yeah, this can hurt you quite a bit in the aggressive deck mirrors. But of course, you can always side it out. So maybe that's okay. And then of course, Meltdown. I think I'm not a huge fan of Meltdown. Like, I think you'd rather just play Rack and Ruin. At least Rack and Ruin is an instant, and for 3 mana, for the same as like Meltdown. Meltdown's probably not killing a bunch of stuff because there's not really any glut of artifacts or whatever. Most of the artifact decks are playing, like the sort of big Tinker style stuff, or maybe it's just like the decks that are playing like the Devourer decks, that are playing like a couple 2 mana artifacts, like the altar and things like that. Obviously, boarding Meltdown in to hit like a Chromatic Sphere is not exactly really what you want to be doing. So and not even mentioning it kills your own Curse Scroll. So Meltdown I'm not a huge fan of. I feel like you're going to be a lot happier with something like Overload or whatever. So there's just not really the matchups where Meltdown can really shine typically. Whereas having just a bunch of 1 mana cards, or even something a little bit more expensive like Rack and Ruin, would probably be a little bit better. Just the way that the decks that are available. For example, Overload being a lot better versus Dreadnought, of course, where Meltdown is 2 mana to kill a Dreadnought, which is not really where you want to be for a deck that's playing things like Daze. That can be a killer too. So anyways, I'm not a huge fan of Meltdown in this format. So yeah, I'd probably replace that. But everything else is fairly typical in this list. We got some main deck pops. Again, pretty sweet if you're expecting a whole bunch of non-basic lands. So yeah, there you go. All right, and this is of course a slightly more standard list, at least the main deck. I mean, we do have only 2 Flame Rift here, and then the 2 scroll 4 bobble thing going on. But yeah, 2 Flame Rift. Again, there are a couple open slots, and you know I think Flame Rift might. I wouldn't say it's the best in general, but it is, again, 2 mana 4 damage is a very good rate. Um, yeah, I don't. It's probably better than like additional copies of whatever shock effect you want, whether that be shock itself, firebolt, seal fire, or whatever. Maybe it's better than volcanic hammer, but I've always been a little bit off it. Like, if you know what the metagame's going to be, if it's just like, here's all these control and combo decks or whatever, it's like, okay, Flame Rift is awesome. But anyways, again, also I like 0 bobble and 4 scroll, but again, that's you know, some people really like the bobble. Never understand it, but hey, that's okay. And of course, the sideboard, having the 4 black vines, that's a bit uncommon. Again, that's very sweet versus a lot of the Durley decks. Very good against the tax rack decks. Not having any anarchy is a little wonky. And then, of course, we have the Pops, Price of Progress in the sideboard this time. And then an additional Sulfuric Vortex to board in, of course, against the slower, dirtier decks, control decks, stuff like mid-range decks like Rock, stuff like that. Pyrostag Pillar, of course, is very sweet versus like the, you know, Mono Blue Storm decks and other decks that just need to play a bunch of spells to do things. So yeah, obviously a lot of sweet stuff here. Pretty typical list though, nothing that wonky. A lot of cards that are all fairly defensible. So yeah, that's it. That's it. There's a whole bunch of red decks. There's like 5, I think I counted, like 2 Sly and 3 Goblin lists, and some other stuff thrown in there. So that was pretty unusual. Didn't expect it to be so red heavy. Although again, it's not like that's too strange, since I would say Sly and or Goblins, depending on what you want to do, is probably the best deck in the format. But again, that's another conversation for a different time. But anyways, that long and the short of it, I hope you enjoyed this. A lot of interesting decks, a lot of interesting, cool things going on. So yeah, thanks for stopping by, and have a great day.